But chapter 20, in some ways, is just a repeat of what we saw at the end of chapter 12. So maybe we can do it fairly fast. You see, in chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah were going down into Egypt, and it was that conversation like, uh-oh, they're going to kill me in order to take you into the harem. Well, I guess the Philistines aren't much more moral or better than the Egyptians were, because now as they're wandering through Philistine territory, there's a king named Abimelech, and he's the Philistine equivalent to Pharaoh in Egypt, and it happens all over again. And so again, Abraham turns to Sarah, will you please say that you're my sister instead of my wife, and then I'll survive as Abimelech takes you into the royal harem. Now, knowing what we do about the first trip, that it was God's idea, not Abraham's, and knowing what we know about Abraham's character, that he's willing to put his life on the line to help his punk nephew, let alone his beloved wife, I have to assume that this was God's command again. Which again makes this a second round of an Abrahamic test, which was equally, perhaps even more so, a Sarah test. Like we talked about last week, Abraham, will you sacrifice your wife? Will you lay her on the altar, trusting that somehow I'll bless you despite that fact? And again, other half, Sarah, we're going to test you from your angle also. Will you lay your virtue on the altar, trusting that God can still preserve it somehow? I know you already passed this test, but some tests are worth repeating. Maybe it's time maybe the circumstances have changed. Maybe you're in a different stage of life and you need to remind yourself of just how faithful you once were, and you can be just as faithful again. So here's the repeat test. And again, they pass it. In fact, there's a great statement from Neely Maxwell, so many great statements from him, about repeated tests. In fact, the whole idea makes me think about that word reprove. Remember D&C 121? Reproving betimes with sharpness. Reproof means to chasten or to chastise. And that's not what's happening here, but just separate it out, say it a little slower, and reprove becomes reprove. To prove again, to test or try again, to give someone a second chance to say, I'm still here, I'm still covenant people. The way Elder Maxwell says it, given the tremendous importance of these virtues now and in the world to come, should we be surprised if, to hasten the process, the Lord gives us individually the relevant and necessary clinical experiences? We do not usually seek these, however, yet they seem to come, don't they? Even when we do not remember having signed up for a particular course. And then this part, closer to what Sarah's going through again. Elder Maxwell says, sometimes we find ourselves enrolled again in the same course. Apparently, we were only auditing before. Perhaps this time it can be for credit. Well, Sarah was not auditing the course on personal sacrifice and faith in God in Egypt, but she has found herself re-enrolled in it. And again, she comes away with straight A's because she exercises faith in God, willingly sacrifices, lays her virtue on the altar. Abraham lays his wife upon the lion couch, or in this case, the king's bed. And once again, the hand is stayed. So, are we starting to see some preview of what we're going to see in chapter 22 with Isaac? Offer the sacrifice. I can spare you actually having to go through with it. He doesn't always. We'll see that. We saw it with the daughters of Oneida, right? But he can. And we have to trust his wisdom and judgment on all of this. But I do love the exchange that then comes with Abimelech and Abraham. Because just like in the Pharaoh story, it's like, what were you thinking? I could have done something really horribly wrong. I'm sure glad that God didn't let me do it. And Abimelech says the exact same thing, basically. What are you thinking? I almost... Okay, so glad I didn't commit adultery. I thought you guys were... Okay, never mind. But the hand is stayed in both instances. The conversation, actually, Abraham is blessed in both instances. Pharaoh enriches him for Sarah's sake the first time, and Abimelech will enrich Abraham for Sarah's sake now. But notice some of the conversation. It's amazing. Verse 3, God comes to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, behold, thou art but a dead man for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. Now, verse 4, Abimelech had not come near her. Again, hand was stayed. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Now, come to think of it, that was Abraham's almost exact question about Sodom and Gomorrah. Wait a minute, if they're righteous, you're not going to destroy them as if they were wicked, right? And so here's Abimelech wondering the same thing. Then verse 5, in the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. It's one of my favorite statements, and it comes from a Philistine king. I didn't know. I acted on what they said. That was the information they gave me. And so I know I was about to do something horribly wrong, but I would have been sitting in ignorance. And not just ignorance, in innocence and in integrity. I love that he puts it that way. And notice the two body parts he lists: integrity of the heart and innocency of the hands. The psalmist will talk about that. Clean hands and a pure heart. It's not just that my actions were innocent, my motives and intentions were pure. That's clean hands and pure heart. Integrity of the heart, innocency of the hands. Then verse 6, God says to him in the dream, yea, I know thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. So yeah, I see your heart. For I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. So I understand the righteous intent. So I'm actually going to help you preserve the righteous action. That's a beautiful thought too. If my heart's in the right place, God will help my hands to stay in the right place. That's a beautiful promise. And then as he says, I suffered thee not to touch her. So I deserve the credit. This wasn't just your fortitude. Okay, don't take all the credit for your righteousness. But what's amazing about this is Abimelech is having a conversation with the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Sarah, okay, Jehovah. And so he's coming to know Abraham's God, Sarah's God, and therefore coming to know something about Abraham and Sarah also, just like we saw back in Egypt. So verse 7, now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Now, it would have been one thing for Abraham to try to make that statement himself directly. Oh, yes, this is my wife, but don't touch her, because I'm a mighty prophet of the mighty God. And if you do anything to her, then you'll be destroyed. Now, if I'm a prideful Philistine king, I'd be like, well, let's prove that. I'll risk it. Yeah, I'm going to suffer some kind of consequence for sin, whatever. Well, let me kill you, and then it's no longer adultery. Fine, then I can do whatever I want. Now, it's amazing that by doing it this way, just like we saw with Egypt, Abimelech is learning these things for himself and establishing a direct relationship with the God of Israel. So, verse 8, therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, told all these things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. So now Abraham and Sarah aren't just under divine protection, they're under the protection of the king. And all of his subjects now know who Abraham is. This is helping with some missionary work, most likely, right? Now, verse 9, and again, this conversation continues, and I love some of the things that come up here. Abimelech called Abraham and said unto him, what hast thou done unto us? Now, he could have stopped with that and like, dude, what's your problem? You really put us into a potential world of hurt. But then notice the next line. And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. Now he goes on in 10, Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And I love Abimelech for this. I know he's outside of Israel. I know he's a Philistine king, and that's usually associated with wickedness. But man, integrity, innocence, and self-introspection. Notice what he said. What have I offended thee? What did I do to you, Abraham? We just met. What did I do to you that you would put me in harm's way with right and wrong and the potential of losing my integrity? What sawest thou that would make you act this way? Now, in a way, Abimelech is giving Abraham a huge benefit of the doubt. Did I do something wrong? Because you mistreated me, so I'm assuming you thought that I had mistreated you? And what did you see here that gave you that impression? I love that. This is a Lord, is it I experience from the Old Testament, from a non-Israelite, not house of Israel. It's amazing to me. What could I have possibly done to make you respond in this way? What did you expect or see that's wrong? Do I have a blind spot? Again, I'm trying to live by integrity and innocency. Help me see where I'm falling short. Help me see where my people are falling short. It's amazing. There's a great story in church history where a woman that knew Joseph Smith is offended by someone. She's been falsely accused. And if anybody knows what it's like to be falsely accused, it's Joseph Smith. So she goes to him and is like, I want redress. I want you to defend my honor and take it out on that false accuser. And Joseph said, okay, well, in my experience of false accusation, I usually think as hard as I can about the situation that the two of us were in and search my own actions, my own words, my own behaviors as carefully as I can, wondering if I might have done something to make them act that way or make them feel that way about me. And you know what, dear sister? Almost every time I do it, I realize, oh, maybe it was that. And by going through that mental exercise, in fact, by going through the pain of accusation, it helped me see something that was in my blind spot. I actually end up appreciating the accusation rather than being offended by it because it's helping me become more Christ-like. You might want to give it a shot. And she did and was very grateful for the experience. That same Lord, is it I attitude is what's driving Abimelech. And then Abraham's response, verse 11, well, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. Surely the fear of God isn't here. Now, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. We'll see lots of problems with Philistines later on, okay? And surely the fear of God, at least the God of Israel, wasn't there. So I did worry about my own life. But I also wonder if this is a negative example on Abraham's part of, Abraham, you didn't come down to see first if sins and cries were all that people were making them out to be. You jumped to a conclusion and assumed these people wouldn't be righteous, and they're willing to be once they come to know the truth. There's more innocency and integrity here than you realize. So don't assume things. Just because people are different, just because people are outside of your covenant, they may be trying to live whatever covenants that they believe are right.